You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. The 16th and 17th centuries were a golden age of espionage. If you are from the Anglosphere, you are accustomed to thinking about the birth of modern spying with the 19th century and the so-called Great Game between Britain and Russia. But the 16th century rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans produced an intelligence war between the two rival empires, which would begin the process towards modern intelligence gathering. A 2016 book, Spies for the Sultan, explored the world of Ottoman spying, and it has recently been translated into English. Joining me is the book author Emrah Safa Gurkan. Professor Emrah Safa Gurkan teaches at the University of Mayıs, Department of Political Science and International Relations in Istanbul. In 2012, he was awarded a doctorate in history from the Georgetown University, and in 2018 was a recipient for the Promising Young Scientists Award and the 14th Kadar Awards, Outstanding Young Scientist Award, Turkish Academy of Sciences, and the Scientific Monograph Award, the Turkish Academy of Sciences. He's also the author of the book we are discussing today. He is also now a YouTuber, and he's also worked on podcasts. And so he's a man of many mediums, shall we say. Professor Gurkan, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Welcome.
It's a great pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, nice to be a part of this.
Yes. And I mean, we're going to obviously be talking a lot about spying and the Ottoman world and the Habsburg rivalry, and I'm going to be asking you a lot about this. But I sort of wonder, as a kind of intro to our audience, I've obviously read a bio out about you, about all the stuff that, some of the stuff that you do, but you are involved in a lot of things. You're actually a YouTuber in Turkey. You do not just history, you do travel, you do all sorts of things. So just kind of tell us a little bit more about some of this other sort of stuff that you do.
Well, even before I received my PhD, we had started a very early podcast program with Chris Creighton, and you had interviewed us like 10 years ago or some Ottoman history podcast. Then right after I became a full-time teacher, starting teaching, not a PhD student anymore, I always did something about media on the side because I want to, talk to people. I want to address people. And I believe the classrooms are now, with the social media, teaching only 10 to 15, never actually was enough for me. Also, history was never enough for me as well. So I have this now YouTube channel, and I've been doing this YouTube programs that one of the most watched ones in Turkey, not only on history, but we have a program called Opus Magnum where we talk about movies, because I really like movies, and I'm a movie geek. And then I travel all around the world. I just started recording them and just, providing information or my insights about, how, like, not only in history, but in general, in social sciences. And after, this is a book about history, but also now I'm writing some, more popular books that combine history, political science, anthropology, sociology, stuff like that. So I use these medias in order to create myself an an audience that make me work harder on subjects that I wouldn't work normally, because the university, you teach the same, and in Turkey it's not like in America that the students are too much interested in stuff like sociology, anthropology, or movies or stuff like that. So these mediums, again, the Ottoman history podcast was a similar thing for me. While interviewing all these people, I learned a lot. So because when you're writing your PhD, you just concentrate for like 4 years on one subject. It's very boring. And it's also very restricting intellectually. But Chris and I thought, okay, we're reading all these books and it works for nothing. Well, let's find the authors of these books and talk with them. So, but later it became that we had to read these books because we had to interview people. Similar thing happened with YouTube. I was doing first I did one history program. It became hugely popular in Turkey. Then I diversified so that my other hobbies will be some sort of a full-time job for me, so that I watch more movies, I read, outside of history, I read more because now I have to do programs for it. And then I realized that people are actually thirsty for it because most of the content, there are like two words. Most of the content in the internet are generally done by amateurs, the dilettante, if you will, who generally look at the unimportant stuff, all this, stuff that actually doesn't tell you anything, not systematic, no theories. They talk about, let's say in history channels, they talk about stuff that are shocking, like advertisement. It's not real history. So, just to give you an example, I recently did a program on martial arts, and it's been watched 400,000 times. In Turkey, even in US, it's too exhilarating for me because such an important figure, which is really hard to understand while reading it, and you share it with people, and you realize actually people are open to these ideas if put in the right context. And I really enjoy doing that, and I get really good feedback. So why not? I think part of me will always be in that field. It has always been since 2010 when we started Ottoman History Podcast.
Yeah, Marshall Hodges is quite a giant in the field. I mean, he's been dead, I think, 50
for 45 years, 50 years.
It's around about then. But he wrote a 3-volume book on the ventures of Islam.
Venture of
Islam. And he's sort of the pioneer of maybe not the pioneer, but he's the one people associate with the term gunpowder empires.
Gunpowder empires, Islamic age, from Nile to Oxus. He's one of the few his aspect on geography in explaining, salinization in the region of Sawat. If a normal guy walking on the street now knows about that because somebody told him that. It's not like, I talk about the stuff that I would have talked about in a doctorate class, and the normal people listen. I think it's not only martial arts, but somebody like David Graeber, whose book Death is full with anthropological detail. It's really hard for me to understand. Even martial arts, the first time I read, I realized I didn't understand. Good thing about doing a program is, I think all teachers are aware of this, because once you teach, you realize you didn't understand everything about it. So because you have to find a system, and then you have to read it carefully. So it's kind of a way to educate myself also, because I realized, even though I have read it twice before making the program, I didn't understand martial arts. It happens very frequently. People talk about Brodel, people talk about Graeber, people talk about Marshall Salins, people talk about Eric Hobsbawm, with an idea, but not quite, because they have never had to talk about them for 2 hours consecutively. And most of us professors teach because it helps us systemize our thoughts, and it helps us to get more than a glimpse of a major author, major scientist, because major scientists write in a very complex way, and then you read it, you kind of have an idea, but then you realize it before you teach it. So it became a huge classroom for me. YouTube became a huge classroom for me, because the other classrooms are not that satisfying in terms of student quality here now. So you have to compensate.
Yes. And you're also, I think when you said the popular history program, I don't know if you're talking about a Turkish one, or because you were also in Netflix show 1453, I think it was called.
Yeah, Rise of Empires.
Rise of Empires, sorry, which was the first season was about the conquest of Constantinople by Mehmed II, which was a docudrama. So there was half drama, half expert interviews, and you were one of the interviewees. In that interview.
I was also historical advisor to that. I didn't know about the drama stuff. I thought it was a documentary while I was doing that. Then I realized, because the drama stuff wasn't it's a very different format. Like you have documentary and drama, it's kind of conflicting. And again, that kind of history is just easy to watch, but it doesn't explain a lot. So it's conquest of the one thing that I did this because they were always asking me the same question. Like, you go to TV, they ask you the same question: the conquest of Istanbul, and Atatürk, the Republic, 16th century, stuff like that. And there are other intellectual subjects you want to talk about, but nobody comes up with a project. Like all the projects that comes to you is about either war, or some sort of a big generalization about the empire and stuff like that. So you kind of stuck. So I think social media gave us professors and intellectuals an opportunity to provide ourselves a media where we can talk about whatever we want to talk about. Because most of the time I've done a lot of interviews. Like 85% of the questions could be summed up in like 2 pages. They all ask the same questions, and you get bored trying to find an answer.
Indeed. I mean, I think that's part of the problem with the media side, because there's partly they have to think about, well, what will an audience actually want to see? And I've worked in television for a long time as well, and there is a sort of limited view about what an audience would want, and that colors the way they sort of shape everything. Because they think, oh, why would I be, if I was so and so on the street and I come and I watch, why would I be interested in that?
And it never will. Like today, when I go to a TV station, they still ask me the question, and sometimes I protest, and they say they wouldn't watch it. Like, so why the hell do they watch what I do more than what you guys do? Like, they don't even get feedback. Like, that's how YouTube actually, because they got this format in their heads and it's fixed. And I understand it, because in 1950s, 60s, all this equipment for live television or television was too expensive. So at that time, everything had to be formal, because, it was really hard to do a retake. It was really risky it was a big, enterprise. Now everybody is the showrunner. Everybody does program. If you want to compete with that, you have to have, and most of the time, the media people don't read anything, so they don't know the depth a proper intellectual could go to, and they don't understand the explicatory power that a good book gives a researcher. They think we are doing some sort of a divan poetry, or like some sort of a, the old stylistic poetry where you say stuff that sounds complex, but it doesn't. It's not that all of us are postmodernists, for Christ's sake. Like, there are some theories that we could talk about. There's all these books that you read also help you see things from a different point of view.
Indeed. It's also about the willingness to be creative with your choices, because I think with history documentary, they have a hard time, I think, thinking about, well, how can we actually be creative in what we do? And in many ways, they need to start looking more at the drama side, because at least in drama, they're thinking creatively about how to do things, not necessarily to sort of spice it up the way it would be in, say, a soap opera or whatever. But those people are thinking a lot more about how to get, how to be creative with everything. And I think maybe they need some inspiration even from that, because, some of the stuff you see, films or whatever, they're much more willing to experiment with the format and how to tell a story in an interesting way. But that's a whole other discussion.
And also now we're coming to a book that is not that's not in the ballpark of what we've been talking about. It's a very strictly niche object. How to say it? Like something that requires a specialist a little bit.
It's a specialist, but I think it's interesting because when you're thinking about spying, that's an ongoing issue in today's politics, right? I mean, you're looking around and you're seeing, for example, what's been happening in the Middle East recently, and the intelligence wars happening there, but also there's also the concept of corporate espionage, which does come up a little bit in your book as well, which is something we're worried about too when it comes to social media companies and their eavesdropping on us. So there's a contemporary relevance to today. So it's not totally niche in that sense. It's an idea, it's a debate that is currently happening. But with that in mind, let's actually talk about the book. So it's
in Turkey, they call me the king of digression. I digress very well. You can talk to me 2 hours straight and not come to the subject. So please lead me, because
I will certainly try to do that. So I think we should just start right at the beginning. What drew you to that as a subject? Why did you want to talk about spying between the Habsburg and the Ottoman Empire?
I didn't. I don't even watch James Bond. I can't care less about spies. But that's not how an early modernist work. Because you see, in history, you have a very imbalanced source base. You never know what kind of sources you will have until you go to an archive. And once you go to the archive, you don't know the second thing, which sources you can use, because there's paleography. There are all sorts of different archives, different languages, and some of the archives are closed, or some of the archives are run by some really nasty person, maybe they don't give you the necessary documents. So you have to decide on the job. So while I was, before even I come to Georgetown, I knew a number of languages, and I had already been to a number of archives in the Mediterranean. So the first idea, while I was doing my master's, was to use this French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese type of thing to like my linguistic competence and Ottoman. You want to mix them. So I was working with Halil Alcek, who's the foremost doyen of Ottoman history. So, but he doesn't know about Mediterranean history. So I had to do Mediterranean history because my linguistic skills were there. If I was left to my own, I would have done something more modern, 19th century or stuff like that. But your specialty also is related to what what kind of skills you have on the table. So at first it was just one military expedition, 1535 and stuff like that. And I started going to the archives, and I started finding documents about spies, corsairs, which means pirates, which was a big deal economically, legally. International law came from piracy, for instance, right? And the third, slaves. So I had prepared three things together, two of which became a book. The third still to come because I got bored of, because writing a monograph can be quite an exhausting process. Then I just put them together. I did spies for my doctorate, and then I wrote a book about Ottoman piracy, which will be translated into English as well, but it's really both better than this and longer, like 3 times longer than this. So it's the way I study. I go to an archive, numerous archives in Venice, in Simancas, Madrid, in Paris, in Rome, Florence, or Istanbul, wherever. Then I look at the documents that you can get and that you can read, and then you find a subject. And with piracy, it was really fun, but spies were less fun for me, because it was more political. With piracy, you can go. There's a legal aspect, there's an economic aspect, there's a social aspect like banditry of Hobsbawm and stuff like that. So that's how I work. It was meant to be a trilogy, even in which I try to depict a different landscape, which we call the borderland, the frontier. So I'm a great fan of. Sorry, I think it's my WhatsApp. Okay, so the problem is solved. Sorry about that. So I'm a great fan of Western movies, and the Western movies speak a lot, I think, in terms of there's this New York and Washington D.C., but there's also the Western world. The Western, I mean, American cowboy movies.
Westerns, yeah.
Yeah. So just like here, Mediterranean was like the wild, wild west at the time, because there's the Istanbul, Rome. You have clear distinction between clear categories. You have Islam, Christianity, you have the state, you have rules, you have law, you have orthodoxy, but you have also, a chaos. You have heretics. You have lawless people. Just like the difference between Washington D.C. and this wild, wild west. I worked on this frontier, the borderland, where all the rules we know, because we historians read texts most of the time, and these texts were produced by 1% of the population who are living in their ivory towers and who know nothing about real life. Most of the time they imagine and they write something and then you believe in it. But now two things come to the picture. First, the archives, where you can actually read what they really think. And even better, you have the press now. You have the normal people producing stuff, with printing press. So add all these together, and you come up with something very interesting, especially for Ottoman studies, because in the Ottoman studies, we don't have printing press in the Ottoman Empire until the 18th century, which means that we don't know how a normal Ottomans or the non-conformist Ottomans, like the Ottomans that weren't state officials in Istanbul, thought. But if you go to other archives, and if you search other archives for testimonies that these people left, let's say in Venice, in Florence, in Madrid, or in Valladolid, and then you see a different world. the world of the frontier, far away from Istanbul, operating on its own, with its own economic and social rules and mores. So it was a totally different world, which people studied a little bit in, let's say, Venetian or French context, but in the Ottoman context, it was really hard because the sources were hard to find. So once I found them, I didn't just be picky about them, and I just studied that subject because that allowed me to see the Ottoman that you can't see only from Istanbul. So all these, the pirates, spies, and these books are written, and the slaves that I haven't written yet. When you put three of them together, you get a different picture of a borderland, the Mediterranean borderland, where all these cultural, linguistic differences that were accentuated by the official sources created by imperial elites so that it fit their mental framework, it all disappears. Poof. Everything is different. There's somebody changing their religion, 3 times. A family like Chigalazade, Jalolu, like changing their religion in every generation, yet still remaining at the top of this imperial aristocracy, whether they're on the Ottoman side or the Spanish side, not mattering. So I believe it was a very new world at the time, and I still believe it is, because gathering all these sources required immense effort of traveling and linguistic competence and stuff like that. That's why I chose that subject. There are other stuff that could have come out of this, but I believe the best was the Corsairs, the pirates, and the second best was the spies and later the slaves that show us how varied, how culturally rich, and how denying, how much these denied these perceptions that stuck in the heads of bad historians, like historians who take every source they read at face value. So that's why I studied that. It wasn't about espionage; it was cultural, and that book also has this cultural element. It's not about the book, because 16th century was a century in which all these tools of espionage was being developed, like concealed writing techniques or postal services for the first time, diplomacy, resident diplomacy, right? Instead of ad hoc diplomacy, as we say it. And they were all being formed, like a bureaucratic structures were being formed, a new diplomacy was formed, but still, they were at their infancy. Even before the 20th century, we cannot talk about, even before World War II, it's really hard to speak of an espionage, like an intelligence, like CIA type of thing, right? These institutions that required the two biggest state apparatus that only came in the 20th century, as an espionage separate from the military, right? With its own techniques and stuff like that. But we don't have that in the 16th century. We have some baby steps, and I talk about these baby steps, but I talk about people. So it's about spies, and even the book's name is Spies for the Sultans. They were working for everyone. So it's not about only Ottoman spies, but Ottoman spies working between Venice, the real center of espionage at the time, Madrid, and Ottoman Empire. And these three were not only three major the important capitals, but they were also examples of three different types of state. The Ottomans as the precursor, as the successor to this Persian type of traditional agrarian empire. The Habsburgs were a great example of how all these feudal arrangements could create a state in which there's one ruler, but 15 different duchies, kingdoms with their own rules. So it's like a patchwork of different feudal arrangements. And the Venice, which is a merchant state with all this republican tradition and all these really bureaucratic nexuses of power. So when you look at them, you see three different stuff. Let's say in Venice, you have a senate. Everything is, you have to talk everything in front of hundreds of people. So are you going to keep a secret in this kind of environment? So three different empires, and how they dealt with espionage, like how they regulated that, and a sea supposedly divided by two civilizations. But when you dig a little bit deeper, you realize that's all a BS to a certain extent. Okay, it's only in the hands all these complexities of real life and the pragmatic nature of these corsairs and spies, because they are on the field, not in the palace in the ivory tower, created a different, more pragmatic environment in which all these differences flourish. Now disappear. What not flourish? Disappear.
Yes, because I think it's before we sort of get into, so I want to talk a little bit about who the spies were, because I think there's some interesting stuff in there. You do sort of say, though, that as you've also just said now, you say it in the book and you just said it just now, that sort of 16th and 17th centuries is when we start to see the baby steps birth of modern spying. But to your mind, you know, I wonder if briefly you could tell us what was, I mean, maybe you can sketch it out a little bit more. What was the actual difference between spying in the 16th century from previous centuries? What made it different?
Well, first of all, they left records. That's one thing. That's a good thing. Second of all, there's almost a world war. For like 50 years, everybody in the Mediterranean is locked in an imperial rivalry between Istanbul and Madrid, which means everybody is ready to spend money. Third, we have Renaissance brought new developments in steganography and cryptography, and now we have resident diplomats, which means for the first time, these diplomats have to write every day or like twice every week to their governments, which means now they are the spies par excellence, right? They are also spies. And the early resident diplomats were kicked out for fear of spying. The Ottomans had they could only stay three years in the first one, then 3 years in the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans didn't want them to develop their or like when the Ottoman ambassadors came, the Venetians were really keen on keeping them under their thumb, like keeping them isolated from the rest of the population. So now you have diplomats, residents, staying in one capital for 4 or 5 years. With that comes certain developments. Now you need some sort of a cryptography because you are writing to your government. You need a reliable postal service, and you need a network of confidence, with which you have to have long-term relationships. It's not like giving money to some crook in a bar and trying to in a pub and trying to get a couple of very unreliable information out of his mouth. Which means now the information gathering is outside of the military. In the past, what we see is that the military, the armies, while they're moving, they were sending out spies, but they were like doing reconnaissance and talking to people, but it's not that reliable. And all these techniques, cryptography, steganography, like writing techniques and concealed writing techniques, postal services, the need to have a reliable and constant network of information, whose number at one point was 105 Habsburg Spanish spies in Constantinople. Most of the time the numbers are exaggerated because they want to get more money, they want to scoop their scoundrels, but still. So all these developments, and also a different development, now you have the arrival of the newspaper. Early news bulletins, or avisos as we call them, handwritten bulletins that talk about all these events happening in different places in the age of exploration. So if you're in Germany, if you're a trader, you have to know what happens in India. You have to know what happens in Zimbabwe. You have to know what happens in Ottoman Empire, so that you buy the correct good at the correct time, and so that you make most of the price differentiation, which created a craze for information. So to sum up, you have an imperial warfare, everybody's ready to pay for it. You have resident diplomacy that develops certain tools required for constant supply of information and the security of that information. So you have to do concealed writing and stuff like that. And you have a craze for information throughout the society, as a result of which information was a concern for everybody, not only those people who govern, but throughout the world. Second, the information now became a civil responsibility as well. It's not anymore armies sending people and just gathering information while they're on their route. So it's like a 7-Eleven event. Like it's like every day 720, not 7. It's like a 724 event. Like you gather information every day and you develop certain techniques, not only for espionage but also for diplomacy, because now diplomats have to write every day to their cabinet.
It's also interesting because in the book you point out it's not just the volume of information that is now being produced, it's the sort of speed at which it travels. I mean, you pointed out that, the Ottomans would get the information to Constantinople, Istanbul pretty quickly, for that time period, where they would learn about developments on the battlefield, fairly reliable reports on what was happening hundreds of miles away fairly quickly. So there's also that dynamic. You talked a bit about the speed of information.
Well, actually, you don't even need a document to actually realize that it's correct. Like, think of an empire in which you move with horses. So it takes, 20, 30 days to reach the frontier. Then you rule that empire with the minimum number of people. So like 15 million people, and you rule them with, let's say, I don't know, 100,000 people. And most of them are soldiers. With bureaucrats, probably you have like within the ballpark of 10,000 bureaucrats. You have to know. It's not, the information was more important because the resources are so meager, so little. But of course, I didn't do that. I knew that, but I checked I traced some information between these archival documents, trying to realize if, like, let's say a new pope was elected, when did the Ottomans hear? Because the price of not hearing that will be too immense, especially within the Mediterranean context. Why? Because Mediterranean naval warfare is extremely expensive. And mind you, when there is no war, you need 20 galleys. When there's a war, you need 200 galleys. And it costs almost 1 million ducats, which is like 1/5 of the Ottoman budget or something like that. It's too huge amount of money. Still, same thing with the Spaniards, who will go bankrupt 3 times in that century. So they have very few money, huge responsibilities, because they kind of overestimated their capacity and engaged in a world war at a time when the economy was running into all sorts of problems like inflation or like overpopulation and all these social problems as a result of it. So with the gunpowder, with the coming of the gunpowder cannons and stuff, the prices go up and they don't have enough money. So they're running against time and budget. And one thing that is really important is how they are going to allocate their finite resources. Let's say come March and April, some people in Madrid should know, or Naples should know, where the likely places that the Ottoman Navy will attack, so that they can divert these resources in a meaningful way. For otherwise, they're spending all this huge amount of money for nothing. This is a stupid ideological war anyways, because their resources, with the military expenditure being considered, could never be enough to go on with this, to sustain that for so long in their bid for the naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. And they realized that, but their mental framework actually put them there. So they're trying to at least make the most out of it. And they're being extremely creative about that. And one part of this creativity is to come up with spies, even though most of them are crooks and provide really shady loyalties to them, but still somehow they make it work.
Indeed. And it's also so important to realize here as well, as you point out in the book, that we're not talking about a centralized agency collecting all this information. In the Ottoman world, as you sort of say in the book, different governors had sort of responsibilities for recruiting spies from all sorts of avenues of life. And I think it's kind of interesting to talk about the diversity of who they're recruiting, but we're going to get on to who the spies are in a minute. I want to focus a little bit about the structure of how intelligence gathering worked. So we've got governors who are collecting it. There's also corporate information as well. So could you talk to us a little bit about that as well?
Well, here's the thing. The state, now, okay, the one big damage that the modern world left on our brains are, we presume institutions we see today exist in the 16th century. We also presume, just now we have one way of looking at things. Let's say we're living in a capitalistic world. We have corporations, we have Roman law, we have states, we have an international order. When you go to 16th century, you may have different systems in place at the same time. Let's say the Venice was bureaucratic commercial republic functioning just like the American government functions today. Lots of bureaucracy. But Habsburg were different. It's not even an empire. It's like the conglomeration of 10, 15 different kingdoms and duchies with its own rules and parliaments and stuff like that. So they were ruling in a different way. The Ottomans were a patrimonial Persian empire, like in the style of former Persian empires, in which the state creates all these pashas and governors and all these military commanders, and they were running their households, the conglomerate of these households, with the Sultan's household at the very center, constituting the Ottoman state. Mind you, the Ottoman vizier, right, was the one who actually circumcised the Ottoman prince, for instance, because that's how he became a vizier. So the official side and the private side were all intertwined. And Ibrahim Metin Kunt wrote about that in English. Actually, you'll see this, and he uses the term the conglomerate of royal and imperial households, and all vizirial and imperial households. So the Sultan's household, Enderun, now we call it like the imperial school. It wasn't. The Topkapı Palace was the home of the Ottoman Sultan, and all these viziers were his servants. So you see how the private and public merge in this system, as a result of which everybody who's a pasha or who's a big major figure has this, it's like a ministry. He's like a ministry with his own people, and most of the time they're not directly tied to the state. There is no state and like the officials. Most of the time you belong to the household of a Ottoman pasha, and that pasha is like a political party because he pushes certain agenda. He's also like a ministry because he undertakes certain functions, and as a result of which, it's the patrimonial empire. People would know, would understand what a patrimonial empire if they know a little about all these former Persian empires. So in this kind of system, obviously, spy. We can't talk about an Ottoman spy. We have to talk about the spy of this pasha, because sometimes they work against each other, because every pasha has an agenda. Because let's say if you're the Ottoman Grand Admiral, you want to provide the information that suits your interests, and you want a war in the Mediterranean. Why? Because you have slaves. If there's a war in the Mediterranean, you find a job for your slaves. They're going to row in the Ottoman ships, in the Ottoman galleys. So it's not that these pashas were providing information without any particular interest or without an agenda. They do that with an agenda in their mind, and as a result of which, now you see all these rivalries between different Ottoman spy masters, which are also political actors, which are pushing in one direction. Little bit similar to this even happens in 20th century. I believe different intelligence agencies, even within a state, somehow compete. It's just to the extent that today it would be considered treason. Because in the end, everybody has their own, and they push that. It creates some sort of a very weird situation.
Yeah, it's a bit the rivalry thing is still something that exists. I mean, obviously the most famous example in the US was before 9/11, the rivalry between FBI and CIA over Al-Qaeda, and in many countries around the world, particularly in countries where you have authoritarian regimes, you will find multiple intelligence agencies competing with each other over intelligence gathering. And this is a way of, there's a few reasons why you would do that, including making sure that they're so busy with each other they don't think to topple you. And so there's all sorts of other.
That is also, that's also one way of, that is the ultimate aim of an Ottoman Sultan. You put, not in terms of intelligence, maybe, I don't know about intelligence, but like they put viziers, they don't allow one vizier to become too successful, then it's really easy to topple a sultan, or at least to disable him, like to put him in a corner. So the sultans work in a similar way. They have to make sure that there should be some rivalry among their viziers.
And also, you're not. I mean, one of the advantages, apart from the obvious political power part, is that if you've got multiple people working against each other, in a sense, they'll give you slightly different informations. And that information can also be useful to you, because there's always the idea that somewhere the truth is between them, and you can sort of work that out. So maybe also from that perspective, because if you have one person who's quite powerful, they can just feed you any information from
Well,
that perspective.
there's a great example in the book about that. One day, there's this Greek Orthodox priest coming to the Ottoman Grand Admiral, Uluç Ali Pasha, who was a Italian convert, but is a really fierce Muslim now who wants to fight a war in the Mediterranean. And he cries and he talks about how the Christians attacked his ships and how all these Muslims were enslaved and stuff like that. I mean, think about the scene. There's this Ottoman Grand Admiral, and there's this Greek priest coming, appearing out of nowhere in the imperial shipyard. There are all these other officials. Quite a mise en scène, quite a scene, right? And then they took this guy to the Ottoman Grand Vizier, and he doesn't buy it, and he actually gives him a beating in the feet, falaka, and then he confesses. Actually, he was planted by the Ottoman Grand Admiral to create a scene so that it becomes a scandal. So the Grand Admiral, the Ottoman Grand Vizier, who doesn't want to fight in the Mediterranean because he doesn't have anything to gain from it, will be convinced to invest money in a war that will make the Ottoman Grand Admiral Uluç Ali, the Italian convert, rich, which somehow staging some sort of a scandal, and just like manipulating media today. Like sometimes we see, politicians do stuff like that in order to justify a war and stuff, or in order to push their own interest and stuff like that. So he created this scene, and so from that you can understand they are not disinterested actors. They are pushing their agendas, and they are ready to. And when confronted, he didn't apologize or he didn't try to exonerate himself. He said, "Look, you brought me here from Algiers. I'm a corsair. I'm a pirate, and you don't spend any money on it. You see how an empire works? Like if I'm here, I have to have some justification. I'm not dying for the sake of the Ottoman Empire. It's not like I'm really crazy about being a Grand Admiral. I'm a pirate. I have thousands of slaves for which I need to find food and work. I'm an enterprise. You have to feed me." Similar thing today with, I believe, most military firms and stuff like the military industrial complex. You have to feed them if you want to keep them alive. But similar thing with the pirates and the spies and all these organisms. They require some sort of investment. And in this context, the corsairs, the pirates, needed a war so that it makes sense logically for an Italian to fight other Italians in the name of a sultan who's Turkish and living in the other half of the world. So in order to make sure that this happens, he was ready to fabricate information. And when actually caught red-handed, he didn't remorse at all. He didn't back down. He was like, there's a logic to my being here, and you have to. So I was trying to fool you because I was right. That's what that was his defense.
It's an interesting one, and this is getting us onto the topic of who the spies were, and because you were also mentioning, at the beginning, this idea of civilizational separation as carrying clearly demarcated lines between them. That's just not the reality of the 17th and 16th centuries. And we sort of see this, how sort of the paucity of borders, of course, and boundaries. And we see this through people as well. I mean, you had some very interesting examples of, as you've sort of started to mention, priests who were spying for the Ottomans, right? You open the book on one particular priest who you identify as possibly being from Thessaloniki, I think.
Thessaloniki, yeah.
Yes, and
he even participated in the Council of Trent, for Christ's sake.
Yes. So talk to us a little bit about him, and then we'll get on to more who the spies were, because his story is quite interesting.
You want me to tell the story of him? So
yes.
he's this. Okay, the Council of Trent is the council that decided the fate of Catholicism. So it's a big event that took place over the years. So all these important, church fathers are in one place, and there's one Greek Orthodox priest claiming to be the Bishop of Thessaloniki, Metropolitan of Thessaloniki, and he wants to join. Since they're Orthodox, you can't just throw him away, but he can't join either. Then they realize that he's not actually. He didn't come just for the purpose of the council. He came so that in order to gather information. So like such a big, he's a proper priest, right? I mean, So there is always an unrealistic hope among the Catholics that the Orthodox will come to terms with them. It never happens. There's no chance. But all these spies, capitalize on that. Spies trying to get money, offering to bring these two churches together and stuff like that. But a high-level official like that, personally appearing in the door, or somebody impersonating him, but still convincingly enough, in both possibilities of the story, we have a very interesting thing. You see, or like even a better story, or like it is, equally interesting. The sons of the Doge, the ruler of Venice. Rulers of Venice are elected for life, even though it's a republic. There's a symbolic head of the republic elected for life. And he's got some illegitimate sons, Gritti family. And they were caught red-handed gathering information for the Ottomans. So the sons of the ruler of Venice were spying for the Ottomans. One of these sons were a confidant, were a favorite of the Ottoman Sultan. And he was using this, he was trying to use this Muslim empire in order to get himself the crown of Hungary. So he wants to be now we have Venice, we have the Ottomans, okay? The Catholic Venice has a ruler whose son is sending his brothers to spy for the Ottomans, and they were being caught by the Spanish. It's a huge scandal. And that the oldest son is also using his power over Suleiman the Magnificent and his Grand Vizier, so that the Ottomans attack Hungary and create a protectorate, and he will be the king of Hungary. And you know how an uneasy situation this created for the ruler of Venice, for the Doge of Venice. You see how complex these relations are. I mean, it's a huge scandal. The Spanish, if the Ottomans go to war with Venice, the only ally that could cope with the Ottomans are Spaniards. So you have one son messing stuff up in the Ottoman realm. You have other sons messing stuff up in the realm of the Spaniards. So this is a huge embarrassment for somebody who was elected to a post because of his symbolic value. And you create a scandal. It's not like he was born. He's not Louis XIV. He's just a grain merchant who became the Doge of Venice because he was elected there. And he just has to, be a symbolic figure. And he becomes an embarrassment because his sons are all over the place, engaging in shady dealings. How about that? You see, these were very interesting people. I think the spies were. It was never a profession per se. So, who were the spies? Next question. I proceeded myself. They were people with cultural roots in 2 or 3 different cultural linguistic groups. Let's say Jews, or like Greeks in Catholic lands. A place like Ragusa, in the Catholic commercial center in the Balkans, with the overlordship of the Ottomans. Those misfits, they don't fit. They have this social capital that allowed them to travel easily, because in the past few people traveled. That also allowed them to get acquainted with people with whom normal people can't get acquainted with. And then they also have these necessary linguistic abilities to pass as locals. Sometimes fifth column guys, expatriates, renegades who change religion, adventurers, and none of never do they content themselves with just espionage. Espionage is a side business. You move from point A to B. If you're a trader, if you're a merchant, you get something from A that makes much more money in point B, right? Information is guaranteed to make much. Like you spend nothing on information, but in the next destination it will mean something. So it's a guarantee. It's a product on which you will make a profit for sure, because you spend nothing on it. And in an age of almost no fast communication before the trains and telegraph and stuff like that, the empire's in panic because they're trying to find a way to get rid of the enemy threat in the cheapest way possible. Why not? And they know all these people, especially some of these merchants are, and they engaged in jewelry trade, especially Jewish ones. So they know the pashas, so they have connections with the right people. So they have the connections. They are coming from, and also even before coming to the port, in every port throughout the Mediterranean, they investigate they interrogate the incoming passengers, so that just for both for a security check, but also to realize what kind of information they could bring. And the Muslims couldn't travel to the Ottoman Empire very easily because of all these restrictions of the intolerant Catholic society. So all these go-betweens, all these people found themselves in a perfect spot to make money.
Indeed, and it was also interesting, I think you point out in the book as well, that there was a case, I think in the case of Spain, where some spies were caught, and they sort of, figured out these people were Muslim, but they tried to figure out, okay, well, were you born Catholic?
Oh, yeah.
And there was a fear, and they were frightened because they thought it's better to be thought of as a spy and go through that judicial process than to be thought of as a convert. Because then you go to the Inquisition. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes.
Apostate, yes.
Most people don't realize that, but Inquisition only has jurisdiction over Christians. So if I'm caught by the Spanish intelligence, they can't do anything to me. I'll be exchanged. They can kill me. It's a civil thing. But probably they will exchange me for some other spy, or they will just sell me into slavery, or they just put me back to work, being a double spy and stuff like that. But if I'm born a Christian, then if I become Muslim, I need to go through Inquisition. The same thing with all these, because Inquisition deals with stuff such as reneging, or such as believing in other gods and stuff like that. A similar thing with witches. Witches became the subject of the Inquisition once they added an element to all these medieval witch stories. Witches were not persecuted by the Inquisition in the medieval ages to the extent that they were in the 16th, 17th centuries. There was no witchcraft. All these witchcrafts come from the 16th, 17th, little bit 18th century. The reason, at least the legal reason behind that, was that they added an element, worshipping the Satan. Because if you worship the Satan, yes, exactly. Now you are within the ballpark of within the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. Similar thing with the corsairs and the spies. If you're not a Christian, if you're not born a Christian, then there's no. But the problem is that legally, all these Muslims left in Spain after 1492, the fall of the last stronghold of the Muslim. At least 1495, 97, or something like that. Their privileges were revoked. And they were told either convert to Christianity or leave. And they didn't leave, but remained secretly Christian. So when they, for instance, go, that's why these Moriscos, Spanish Muslims, were also within the jurisdiction of Inquisition, because technically they were Christian, but they weren't. But, the similar thing with the spies. If you are an Italian and you become, you were Giovanni, and then you became Mustafa, right? You get a circumcision, painful process after a certain age, but still you sacrifice that. And mind you, people were volunteering to become a eunuch at the time in the palace. They were doing all sorts of stuff in order to make money, like sacrificing your manhood. But again, king of digression, I'm not digressing. Let's say you became a Turkish, you became Muslim, then you get caught. The first thing you have to do is to make sure that you were never an Italian. And there are very funny instances. In one of these, there's this guy who was caught before and then who got away. But in the third time or something like that, somebody recognizes him, and he actually denies being an Italian. And the Inquisition is a very complex mechanism. Then they're trying to get information on him, and it takes many years, and he's stuck in a cell with no punishment. The trial going on for years. He can't speak any Italian. He doesn't speak with anybody. He's so stubborn. They never. It takes like 5-10 years, because the thing with the Inquisition, there is no inquisitorial trials were different from accusatorial trials. There is no DA accusing you. For capital crimes, you have to confess. That's why, they have to make sure that you confess, especially if it's going to be like a really huge. So the problem is that he doesn't confess, but all the evidence is going in the other direction. So it stayed in the limbo for many years. With this, I think the name was Francesco Guicciardini or something like that, or the Muslim name was Ali. It's in the book. This guy remains just like that, stuck in that role, so that he actually did not receive a sentence. He doesn't receive a sentence, but he doesn't get out either. So if you go to 16th century with a time machine, and if you change your religion, and if the Catholic Church gets you, deny being a Christian. That's my advice.
Well, we will put that message out there to anyone thinking of
very useful message. I believe it will save hundreds of lives.
Indeed. And it's interesting when you're talking about, you rightly mentioned that the whole pursuit of witchcraft and witches is actually closer to a 16th and 17th century phenomenon rather than a medieval one. And it's interesting because obviously diabolicalism, as it's called, which is the worshipping of Satan, countries that had that's where you saw lots of prosecutions, successful prosecutions. Countries that didn't have it, England largely didn't, you saw very low conviction rates. But that's a whole I'll need to talk to someone about witchcraft.
Yeah, I just added, it's a very modern concept. It requires a modern society. It requires modern tools of prosecution. It requires a modern it requires a society in which that kind of mania would never fly would never happen in a medieval society. It requires some, I can't explain it, but there are a lot of books that explains it. So just again, I digress. I am really good at talking about stuff that are not related to me.
Okay, so I think the question I now want to ask about is counterintelligence, or because Istanbul itself was also a hotbed of many spies. So my question is, how did the sort of Ottomans try to deal with this issue of lots of spies in their midst?
By creating too many information. That's the best. Like, if you can't control the gossip. Do you remember in which there was an Office episode in which Michael just said something he shouldn't have said about Stanley's wife, and then he created versions of that story so that it doesn't become obvious that he leaked the story, or there was one story, so that he could deny his own involvement. So similar stuff. You created a huge chaos of information. Because most of the time, the real issue is not to gather information; it's to qualify that information. It's to, differentiate between good information and bad information. That required time. So the Ottomans realizing that, Istanbul is surrounded by, it's easy to escape from Istanbul. It's really hard to control people. You have people from 20 different ethnicities. 3, 4, 5, 6 denominations, all three, Semitic religions. You have all these ethnic stuff, and you have, part of Istanbul is just like Holland or something, or Italy or something like that. The Galata part. It's like even the buildings, and they are constructed in the European style. It's so hard to control. They actually provide a lot of. There was this one article that I didn't put in the book about how the Ottomans actually create all this information. I wrote a separate article about that. So the real counterintelligence was about catching spies, and they did all sorts of stuff. But the real trick was to create as much information on the table, because counterintelligence is a little bit about controlling spies, catching spies. You can do it to a certain extent, and they have used every variety. And one big advantage they had in terms of counterintelligence was that few people moved at the time. Let's say in the 17th century, one of these Muslim slaves ran away from Vienna. And that while he was in the woods, a number of bandits attacked him, robbed him, and thought they killed him. But he wasn't killed. So he went to the authorities, and then they found these bandits. So how the hell do you find bandits operating in the woods and stuff like that? He couldn't recognize them, because only few people, if you talk about 5 people that were in this woods 5 days ago, and there are only a number of places they could go, and there are only a number of 5 people team that actually went through the gates. So there was everybody was being closely watched. So in an age when you don't have any surveillance techniques, how did they find criminals? How did they find people like those guys who attacked this poor Muslim slave? Because few people moved, and people who moved was drawing attention. So it was really what the Ottomans did was to record everything, passerbys, those who came and go, and stuff like that. But a much more problem is not only spies, because it's not about controlling the spies, because spies are on the road, but they're also informants. Like, even you don't need to be a spy. You can be a merchant, and some Ottoman pasha provides you with some information, or some Ottoman janissary talks about something you shouldn't have talked about, and then you go back. That means, and there are some rumors, most of the time they can be true. So what the Ottomans do also, they were creating a number of different, especially in the warfare, let's say in a siege, they were planting evidence that talks about, they were planting letters among their soldiers that talks about some sort of military stratagem that was totally untrue. That was exactly the reverse of what the Ottomans would do. So you read those letters, and then you believe that the Ottomans will do that, but they do the opposite. They do all sorts of disinformation and misinformation at the same time. So counterintelligence for controlling spies, make sure that spies are caught to the extent that they had to the extent that they could. The second was disinformation, so that the rumors, at least there's not one rumor that could be true, but there are like so many rumors or so many information on the market, just like Michael Scott did in that famous Office episode, so that you don't know which one to believe, because the real issue is to find the correct version.
So what are you sort of working on now? What other projects have you got going in terms of your research?
Well, I wrote this book about the pirates, and then I wrote a book about trade in a third monograph about trade in the early modern Mediterranean. I have to write that slave book, but again, I also wrote a couple of books which became really popular in bestsellers and stuff like that. They weren't really popular in the sense that they were talking about fun stuff, but no, they were written in without footnotes and stuff like that. So now I'm working on this slave and a fifth monograph, seventh or eighth book it will be, fourth monograph on Ottomans and Europe as a general study. But these are all, I don't work like on one project. I just gather information, like put them in one place, think about them, and then when I feel like it, I write. I wrote these two books because I wrote these books not because I had to write them, but I just I could have written them a little bit earlier or later and stuff like that. But the third installment should be about slaves. That will be pirates, corsairs, slaves, and also I will be writing a general book again about the Ottomans and Europe and how they perceived each other, what kind of dealings they had, because most of the time people are just stuck with they all repeat the same resources, but I have studied those resources that are not studied by people before, so I can use them and do stuff like that. So I have like two carries at the same time. One is like about this Mediterranean world, the borderland in the world, and the second is a little bit much more this in the popular bestseller book stuff, where I talk about like in one of these books, I talked about why did the Ottomans not go to America, because it's a big issue that they believe that the Ottomans. And then I studied it through the lens of economy, sociology, or even shipping technique. It wasn't possible for a ship to go from Istanbul to Brazil. It just doesn't make sense. But everyone asks questions like that. So one side is books that deal with these popular issues in a scientific way. The other is about Mediterranean history. But I have written a lot. I felt like not in the volume, but I'm really tired of having to meet a deadline every day. That's like it's still a bit exhausting. I don't do that in the last 6 months, but between 2009, 2023 to 2023, I have always had a deadline waiting for me, and it's probably I'm in my midlife crisis. I don't want to have deadlines anymore. I'm not gonna So
Yes,
it's
indeed.
really, it's becoming exhausting, especially given that I also have to run a YouTube channel that has to produce. There are all these deadlines are killing me.
Yeah, we need to get rid of all deadlines. Before we sort of leave, and I'll leave you on this question, because you've mentioned obviously your books and your content are quite popular in Turkey. What is it that people are sort of interested in Turkey? What are they looking for? And what is it about your work that they find interesting?
I believe it's not about only history, because I combine history, movies, and stuff, and also sociology, all sorts of stuff together. I believe that kind of academy actually constricted me, like restrained me in a certain subject. When I talk about in Daily Matters, I talk about anthropology, sociology, social. I talk more about social scientists. That's why I wouldn't have chosen 16th century. I would have chosen 19th century, 20th century, where I can talk about major topics. I believe it's not. Let's say, for instance, the YouTube channels that talk about history in English, they are all how to say, they all talk about they're geek stuff. I don't do that kind of stuff. I talk about big forces of history, right? Like when I talk about martial arts, and I talk about Nile Oxus, I talk about the contemporary advantage that the nomad societies have in these three centuries because of certain geographical and climatological differences. When I talk about modernity, I talk about the failure of neoliberalism. When I talk about 1927, when I talk about World War II, I talk about the economic crisis, or I talk about how the trains change the people move. I don't talk about whether Hitler was a maniac or not. I take things much more in much more structural in a much more structural way, and most of the time that's not what people do. That's what people do in the university, but they don't do it in front of the public. They all run like old media. They all talk about, there's this guy who actually ate his friends in a trail in Colorado. Or like there is, did you know that the Austrian government actually declared war on kangaroos or something like that, on emus or some stupid animal. Anyways, you see my point? They do all this stuff just because they're amateurs, and I have like thousands of, you can Google thousands of stories like that. But what actually make me popular was that I explained history in a way that was not explained before, not outside of university. And also, I like to talk, as you can very well see.
Professor Gurkan, thank you for talking to us about my conversations.
Thank you for inviting me over, and good luck.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to catch up with this episode or previous Memo Conversations, you can go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more Memo Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.